send it over to Sue Osbach. Sue?
Thanks so much, Carrie, for all that helpful information. I am Sue Osthoff, and I'm with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and we're located in Philadelphia. And I want to thank you for being part of today's webinar. This is actually the 5th in our series of webinars from our project on ending mass incarceration, centralizing racial justice, and developing alternatives, the role of anti-domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Yes, that is a long title. But before we go further, I really want to take a second to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their support of this webinar and for the support of the project that we're working on. So, as you're probably aware, today's webinar is titled Eliminating Racial Inequality Throughout the Criminal Justice System. And in an effort to save time, can you advance the slides for me, Carrie? I'm not seeming to be able to do it. Thank you. I'll do a very brief introduction of our speakers today, Marc and Nazgol Ghandnoosh. As you can see from the slide here, both Marc and Nazgol work at the Sentencing Project, which, if you don't already know, really is a fabulous organization that we at the National Clearinghouse and probably many of you on this webinar count on for excellent information and for all of their important policy work. Really, kudos to you all at the Sentencing Project. As you can also see from the slide here, we have two very experienced and accomplished speakers today. You can see in Marc's bio that he is one of the country's leading experts on sentencing policy, race, and criminal justice system. And he's not just saying that in his bio. That is actually true. Marc is the executive director of the Sentencing Project, and not only is he super smart, he's also extraordinarily generous with what he knows. And he has helped me and our organization many times since we met way back in 1990. Yeah, Marc, I actually went and looked up when we met at that ASC conference in Baltimore. Nazgol Ghandnoosh is a research analyst at the Sentencing Project, where she both conducts and analyzes research. I actually met Nazgol at the Eastern State Penitentiary, which is this amazing historical museum here in Philadelphia. And we were at a community meeting to talk about an exhibit on mass incarceration, and Nazgol was one of the consultants on what turned out to be an award-winning exhibit. And she has done a lot of really excellent work, some of which you'll hear about today. So Marc and Nazgol, there's so much more I could say about you, but I do want to turn it over. So if you want to add some additional information, feel free to do so when you get the mic. As Carrie pointed out, we'll be collecting questions for Nazgol and Marc during the presentation. We plan to leave about, or at least 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, as Carrie suggested, and I'll be collecting them. And for those of you who don't have access to the webinar service, or if you're joined via phone only, you can email your questions to Dot at ncdbw.org. So DOT@ncdbw.org. So Marc and Nazgol, thank you so much for all of your incredible and important work, and thanks so much for your willingness to share it with all of us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you two. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Sue. We're delighted to be here. Thanks for your kind words, and we've also really appreciate the collaboration we've been able to have with your organization over many years, and delighted to be here today to talk with all the scholars and advocates on the call around the country. I just want to start off and try to frame the issues of race in the justice system. Then Nazgol will delve into those issues more deeply or so, and then we'll have a conversation with everyone. The big picture is, if we go back a little more than a half century to 1954, the year of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, on the day of that decision, there were about 100,000 African Americans behind bars in our prisons and jails. Since that time, we've had a half century of the opening up of social and economic opportunity for many people for whom that had not been possible before. We've seen the increased diversity of leadership within the criminal justice system and other institutions in society. We still have a long way to go, but we have made undeniable progress over this time. And yet, if we look at the criminal justice system and incarceration specifically, we see that that figure of 100,000 African Americans behind bars has now grown to more than 600,000 today. So progress in many areas of society, and yet when we look at the criminal justice system, the situation for African Americans and many other people is considerably worse, more bleak than it was in that historic year. So how do we explain this? To some people, this is a function of crime rates, and they would glibly say, if you do the crime, you do the time. What do we know about crime rates? Yes, for certain crimes, African Americans are arrested at higher rates than other groups, but we don't have to dig very deep to see that what we're looking at there is largely a function of socioeconomic disparities, not a function of race. But we also know that while differences in crime rates explain some of what we're seeing, that it's also policies and practices within the criminal justice system that contribute substantially to these disparate outcomes. That has to do with decision-making by practitioners, allocation of resources within the justice system, implicit bias, the impact of what we might think of as race-neutral policies that in practice have a very direct racial effect. So none of this means that these decisions and outcomes are necessarily a function of conscious racial bias and racism. In many cases, they may not be conscious, but the failure to anticipate the consequences of some decisions is the real failure of the justice system. So I think our challenge is to try to identify each decision-making point of the criminal justice system at which disparities are produced, and we know that this is a collective experience at each stage of the justice system, and how can we work with policymakers and practitioners to address and eliminate these disparities. One final word, people will sometimes contend that we can either reduce racial disparities or we can promote public safety, but we can't do both. And we believe that's fundamentally wrong. Unless we can eliminate racial disparities, we will not have a justice system that's fair and just and meaningful. And if we want to promote public safety, then we need to have a justice system that's fair and perceived as fair by all segments in our society. So that's the big picture, and let me turn it over now to Nazgol Ghandnoosh to look at how we can examine all these different changes and decisions at various stages of the justice system. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Marc. Thanks to everyone who's participating and for all the work that you're doing and for letting us know, some of you, where you're calling in from or dialing in from through the chat. And thanks so much to Sue and Carrie and Dot for putting this together. So I want to start with showing you a couple of charts and graphics that sort of elaborate on the points that Marc made, and then try to organize the thinking about what the sources of racial disparity are in the criminal justice system. And I'll identify 4 sources and show you examples of efforts from around the country to tackle those sources of racial disparity. So in this chart here, what you can see is the lifetime likelihood that someone born in 2001 in the United States, who's 16 years old now, the lifetime likelihood that they will go to prison at some point in their lives.
And what you can see is, if I showed you an international perspective, the lifetime likelihood of going to prison in the United States is much higher than for our peer countries. But there's also a huge amount of disparity by gender and also by race and ethnicity. So the group that is most likely to experience imprisonment, and that's prison, not even including jail, is African American men. So a young man born in 2001 who's African American has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison at some point in his life. So that's about 6 times higher than the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for white men, and it's also higher than the likelihood for Latino men, who also have a higher likelihood than whites. And for women, you can see similar racial disparities, but women have a lower likelihood of going to prison in their lifetimes. And so this is an astounding statistic, that 1 in 3 black men will go to prison at some point in their lives unless we change current rates of imprisonment and the disparities. And so the goal is to figure out why this rate is so high for this particular population, for African Americans and for Latinos in particular. And I think that the answer, a lot of people like to look at one end or the other of the spectrum, and so here are both of them just as an example to kind of provide some contours for the discussion. On the left-hand side is one chart that I like to use to show disparities in crime rates. And so this chart is showing you the likelihood of homicide victimization for African Americans versus whites. And what you can see in this time period between, for example, in the last 20, 30 years, the risk of homicide victimization was about 6 times higher for African Americans than for whites. Homicide is a generally intraracial crime. People generally kill people of others of the same race or ethnicity, and so that means homicide offending, is higher among African Americans than whites. And that has to do with, as Marc mentioned, differences in socioeconomic status. If you put white Americans in urban areas and hyper-segregated urban areas, and you concentrated the economic disadvantage in those neighborhoods, and you threw in the level of guns that we have into the mix, you would have a very high level of white homicide victimization and offending instead, and you would see these trends turned around. So there are differences in criminal offending when it comes to the most serious crimes. This is not true as you go down the scale and you look at much less serious offenses. For less serious crimes, whites and African Americans tend to commit the crimes at very similar rates, and yet African Americans are much more likely, and Latinos are more likely to experience the criminal justice consequences. And so that you can see on the right-hand side, where I picked out what I think of as one of the most lowest levels of offenses, marijuana arrests. So you can see, this is based on a study that the ACLU did, marijuana usage rates are almost identical for African Americans and whites, and yet African Americans are over 3.5 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites. And so when you look at across a variety of crimes, you would see some combination of these factors explaining disparities in imprisonment between whites and blacks and Hispanics, partly to do with crime, but a large part of it has to do with differences in criminal justice policies and enforcement. And it's this right-hand side that I'm really going to focus on for the talk, to look at what are the sources of disparities within the criminal justice system that shouldn't be there, that have nothing to do with criminal offending, that are producing the disparate outcomes. So this is I'm going to draw on this report that we produced a couple years ago. It's called Black Lives Matter, Eliminating Racial Inequity in the Criminal Justice System. And the 4 sources of racial disparity that we identified within the criminal justice system are, first, racial bias in the use of discretion. And I'll go into each of these and describe them in turn. Second, disparate racial impact of race-neutral policies. Third, policies and decisions that disadvantage low-income people, and fourth, policies that exacerbate socioeconomic inequalities, and I'll describe each of those. So first, racial bias in the use of discretion. This is the source of bias that I think I think about most often and I see the most news coverage of and I think we're most familiar with. So this has to do with the decision that criminal justice practitioners make, like police officers, prosecutors, judges, decisions that they make and evaluations that they make of criminal culpability. And so here's an example from Charles Epp and colleagues' study in Kansas City, where they looked at how often drivers were stopped by police. And what they found was when they surveyed people, they found that there were not a lot of differences in traffic stops when you looked at traffic safety stops. Those are the kind of stops that police officers make when there's a pretty obvious violation. So when someone runs a light, for example. But what they found was that there was a lot of racial disparity in investigatory traffic stops. And investigatory traffic stops are where the officer has a lot more discretion about whether or not to make the stop. So an example would be if someone changed lanes without signaling, or if an officer doesn't give any reason at all for making the stop. And so what Charles Epp and colleagues found was that African Americans, men and women, were much more likely than whites to experience a traffic safety stop in Kansas City. Similar results have been found in other parts of the country as well. Ferguson, I think, is a textbook example of this, where African Americans were ticketed, pulled over at a much higher rate than white residents in that area. But so here what they found in this study was that if you controlled for the value of the vehicle, the age of the driver, the racial disparity still existed. And it was greatest among the group that I'm showing you in this chart here, which is drivers under the age of 25. So there's a lot of research in the criminal justice field that shows that most people in the criminal justice system do not intend to produce disparate outcomes like this. They want to treat people fairly, but good intentions only go so far, and as a result of implicit bias, unless there are systematic checks in place to monitor people's work, the tendency is for people to treat African Americans and Latinos as more criminally suspect than whites. So as an example of the kind of work that's being done to address this source of racial disparity in the justice system, so we can look at Baltimore and many other jurisdictions where police departments are undergoing implicit bias training. An example of addressing this in the work of prosecutors can be found in Milwaukee, where prosecutors have eliminated racial disparities in drug paraphernalia charges by monitoring how often they bring these charges against people depending on their race, and creating a system of accountability, so that when a prosecutor is producing a disparate outcome, they have to account for that and explain that. So the next source of racial disparity in the justice system is policies with a disparate racial outcome, with a disparate racial impact. And so examples of this are the crack cocaine sentencing disparity in federal sentencing law in some states as well. But I want to show you here another example, drug-free school zone enhancements. So these are policies in place that increase sentences if someone is caught selling drugs in a school zone. Now, I think that intuitively this makes a lot of sense, right? We don't want people selling drugs near young children, and especially to young children. But what happens is this idea that abstractly sounds good when you put it into practice, as for example Indianapolis did, and you can see that the map there is showing you what drug-free school zones look like in Indianapolis. So the yellow areas are areas where if you were caught selling drugs, you would get a sentencing penalty, a sentencing enhancement for being in a school zone. And these school zones were computed at 1,000 feet, and they were from not just schools, but also youth centers and public housing. And so what happens is nearly the entire city gets covered by this sentencing enhancement. And so then if someone is caught selling drugs in Indianapolis, they're likely to face a sentencing enhancement. If someone is selling drugs in the suburb of Indianapolis, they're much more likely to find themselves outside of a school zone because the area is just more spread out. So now we know in terms of demographics of who's more likely to live in cities and who's more likely to live in suburbs. So a policy like this has the effect of increasing penalties for people of color who are more likely to live in urban areas relative to whites. Other examples of policies with disparate racial impact are police policies like stop and frisk and broken windows, where police officers are sent to particular neighborhoods and encouraged to make a number of stops and checks of individuals, or broken windows policing, where police officers are encouraged to target low-level offenses with the idea that can help to reduce violent crime rates. So that has less to do with the discretion of an individual officer. That comes into play as well, but it also has to do with the policy of the entire department. So some examples of reforms to address this source of racial disparity, one of them is Indiana. That 1,000-foot school district drug-free school zone that I described has been reduced to 500 feet. It no longer includes public housing complexes and youth centers, so only schools now. And it requires that minors be reasonably expected to be present at the time of the drug sale. So again, all of these seem like common sense reforms to a piece of legislation that completely overshot it and had this very harmful impact on sentencing disparities. Connecticut, similarly, has modified its drug-free school zone sentencing laws. New York City has significantly curbed stop and frisk as a result of a court decision. Meanwhile, crime rates in New York City have continued to plummet, and the city is also scaling back its broken windows policy. And then I have another example at the end of Iowa, Connecticut, and Oregon passing racial impact laws so that they make an analysis of racial impact before implementing a new criminal justice law. So similar to environmental assessments before passing legislation, these kinds of reforms intend to not be caught with unintended consequences, have some anticipation of what the racial and ethnic implications of a piece of legislation would be. Okay, now the third source of racial disparities in the justice system is economic disadvantages. And so a couple examples here. The person pictured is Khalif Browder, who at age 16 was arrested for stealing someone's backpack. He was sent to Rikers Island, and he couldn't post bail. His family couldn't post bail. It was set at $900 through a bail bond. And so he ended up staying in jail for 3 years awaiting trial. In the end, the charges were dropped against him, and so he was released. And soon after his release, he committed suicide in 2015. And so this is an example of the many problems here in terms of how he was treated at Rikers Island. But also, I think one of the critical questions is why he was kept there in the first place. And that had everything to do with the fact that he couldn't post bail. And so pretrial release, when it requires money bond, can disadvantage low-income people. And because of the correlation between race and economic status in our society, that means that it's going to disproportionately lock up people of color and produce worse outcomes for them. When people are held pre-trial, they're more likely to accept less favorable plea bargains that requires some jail or prison time compared to had they been released and been able to negotiate their criminal justice outcome outside of jail. So that's one example. Other examples are inadequately funded indigent defense programs. So people of color are more likely to rely on these programs, and their inadequate funding makes it so that they're not able to get the best representation that there is out there in order to navigate the system. So a couple of examples of efforts to ease economic burdens. New Jersey recently reformed its bail system to emphasize risk assessment over monetary bail. So previously, as long as you could post bail, you could be released, whereas now judges make a risk assessment, and people who are deemed to be low risk are not held in pretrial detention just because they're not able to post bail. Another example that's provided from Berks County, Pennsylvania, is from the youth justice system, which was able to reduce, in Berks County, they were able to reduce the number of youth in secure detention by increasing reliance on non-secure shelters for youth who are not able to safely return home. So that requirement that youth be able to return home to avoid detention and creating an alternative for those youth has helped to reduce the number of them that are held in secure detention. Another example that I've been been thinking about recently living in D.C. is fare evasion. And so there's a reform that's been proposed in Washington, D.C. that's already been implemented to some extent in New York and Washington State to decriminalize fare evasion, so on public transportation. So when someone tries to not pay and board a bus or a metro, which actually a council member here admitted sometimes having not been able to pay and being allowed to board a bus. So you can imagine being, the likelihood of that happening depending on your race could vary. So what these reforms try to do is to just make a civil offense, have the person be issued a ticket rather than be arrested and dragged through the criminal justice system. So the final source of racial disparities in the justice system is the lifelong punishment that comes with having a record. And so what I have shown there is what's the box in job applications that ask whether or not you have a criminal offense in your history. And some of them ask about arrest. Often they ask about a felony conviction. And so what these kinds of policies do is that it makes it incredibly hard for someone who's gone through the criminal justice system to then come out and get back on their feet and desist from criminal offending. Another example of the lifelong punishment that we impose on people is restrictions on where people can live, reducing access to welfare benefits, and so cash assistance and food stamps, in particular for people with felony drug convictions, and also eliminating access to student loans for that population as well. And then the final example I have of criminal justice policies that exacerbate socioeconomic disparities is just in general this idea of over-investing in punishment and under-investing in preventative programs and in drug treatment programs has the consequence of leaving, of a missed opportunity to invest in communities that are struggling with crime rates. But if we're just taking people out of those areas and locking them up, we're not addressing the underlying issues that's leading people to crime and making that a viable option in the first place. And so examples of efforts to address these problems, so 12 states and 60 cities now ban the box, removing questions about criminal history from the initial job application. So usually the question comes later in the process. It's not eliminated completely, but at least the person with a criminal record has an opportunity to get their foot in the door and make a first impression. And so just to be clear, these ban the box policies generally apply to public sector employment, but in some instances ordinances have also extended to contractors that do business with the city as well. So another example of reforms is that 13 states have fully opted out of the cash assistance ban, and 9 have done so out of the food stamps ban, and others have done so in part. So this is the restriction on food stamps and cash assistance. It's up to states to whether or not they opt in or out of that restriction. The federal government does not impose it, and so there's been a lot of advocacy and organizing around the country to encourage states to not restrict this form of assistance to people that are trying to get back on their feet after a criminal conviction. And we've done research that shows that these kinds of policies in particular disproportionately impact women of color who rely on these forms of assistance. And then the final example of a reform provided there is Proposition 47 in California, which passed in 2014. So it was a ballot-approved initiative. It reclassified a number of low-level offenses from felonies to misdemeanors, which would prevent people from being sent to prison if convicted. And it also, and this was a very exciting part of it, reinvested annual prison savings, planned to reinvest the prison savings in crime prevention efforts. And so this is the idea of justice reinvestment, of scaling back spending on criminal justice, on prisons and jails, and investing that money more effectively for communities that are continue to struggle with crime rates. Okay, now I want to go back to the other side of this page that I showed you earlier and just talk a little bit about the left-hand side, about why, about the disparities in criminal offending and what we might do about them in the first place. So there's a lot of research that suggests, what works in terms of reducing crime rates. I think of it sometimes as, what we know that we see very low rates of crime in affluent communities. So what do those communities have? What do middle-class communities that can achieve low crime rates? What do they have? They have jobs. They have good schools. They have access to health care. So those are the things that we need to provide communities and populations that are struggling with criminal offending. And there's plenty of research that shows that programs, for example, that seek to reduce segregation, residential segregation, that increase employment, that increase access. Recently, there's been research that shows that Medicaid expansion has helped to reduce crime rates. So these are the things that work. And when we think about how to spend criminal justice dollars, a lot of times there's the failure to compare what value we get from sending someone to jail or prison compared to if we invested that money, for example, in a targeted education program or an employment program. That's the kind of comparison that we need to make. And a lot of research suggests that, for example, even when it comes to homicide that's being depicted here, sending someone to prison for 30, 40 years or life for the most serious offense, homicide, means that we're keeping them in prison at a period of time where they're very unlikely to reoffend. We're getting very little benefit in terms of deterring other people from committing crime, and it's very expensive to incarcerate people that are elderly, and that is money that we could be using on much more effective crime prevention, drug treatment policies. And so why is it that we're not investing more in these treatment and prevention options? And one example, one explanation that I want to offer is, and this elaborates on a point that I made in our report, Race and Punishment, that's pictured on the left. One source of the problem is racial perceptions of crime. So to the extent researchers have shown that the more Americans, and in particular white Americans, the more they associate crime with people of color, the more likely they are to support harsh criminal justice policies. So, to be in favor of the death penalty, to be in favor of stricter sentencing, rather than investing in prevention and drug treatment and these kinds of programs. I think a lot about, I heard a talk by Reverend Vivian Nixon, who's very active on criminal justice reform and education issues, and in particular, and she once said, the quality of the solution depends on who is impacted by the problem. So just to repeat it, the quality of the solution depends on who is impacted by the problem. Crime is a problem that disproportionately impacts people of color in our country. And unfortunately, the solutions that we've come up with to this problem are not the best solutions that we know that are available. So I want to end on a more upbeat note. So here is a chart, but there's good news and bad news. I'm going to show you some charts with my upbeat note. So here is a chart showing you the reduction in the number of youth in residential placement. So the number in the juvenile justice system has achieved a quiet miracle. It's reduced the population in confinement by about half since 2000. We would love to see that happen in the adult criminal justice system. But so this is the kind of good news that we've seen around the country. A lot of times people point out this has happened in Texas, and it's wonderful that it's happened there, but it's pretty much shared in every state. They've significantly reduced the number of youth in secure detention and residential placement, and that's because of the work of criminal justice practitioners and advocates, encouraging them to realize that the best place for young people is at home rather than in criminal justice, in juvenile justice facilities. We've seen some progress also on the adult side. So since reaching the peak prison population in 2009, the overall U.S. prison population has come down by 5%. Now that's pretty modest, but you have to keep in mind that that's after almost 4 decades of the prison population increasing every single year. So there's been a 5% overall reduction in the prison population since it reached its peak. And here you can see actually some states that well exceed that reduction in the number of people incarcerated. So New Jersey is at the top with a 35% reduction in its prisoners since 1999. New York ranks very high, also California, and we've done some research highlighting how these states have been able to achieve these high levels of decarceration. So by reducing the number of people going into prison, by reducing the sentences that they're serving, in particular for drug offenses, by reducing parole revocations and the community under parole supervision that might be sent back to prison in the first place. So that's how they've done it. But what's important to realize is that these kinds of race-blind reforms are not going to be enough to achieve racial equality in the criminal justice system. So what we need to do is not just reduce the number of people that are incarcerated, which we've been working towards, but we need to always do that keeping in mind that we have a goal of reducing racial disparities. Because what can happen is, as I've written here, reform strategies that fail to incorporate an explicit goal of reducing racial disparity may fail to achieve these goals, and in fact, they may exacerbate racial disparities. And so this has actually happened in the juvenile justice system that I showed you some charts for earlier. So my colleague Josh Rovner has recently documented this and has shown that while the rate of in confinement for youth of all racial and ethnic backgrounds has come down, the racial disparity, so when you compare the rate of confinement for black youth versus white youth, has not improved, and in some states it's gotten worse. And this is true also for Hispanic and Native American youth. So that's why it's critical that we not just work to reduce the number of people that are incarcerated and the number of youth that are in the juvenile justice system, but also try to work to reduce racial disparities as well. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
So if you have questions for our speakers, please put them in the chat. Nazgol, at this point we have one question, and that is from Rachel, and she asks, what impact does certification have on juvenile justice system? Do the numbers account for juveniles placed in adult facilities?
Oh, this is a great question, and it's actually beyond my expertise of the juvenile justice system to answer that. Let me see if Marc is able to help with this.
No, generally when juveniles are waived into the adult system, they would show up in state prison counts and not in the juvenile residential placement. So, we saw a surge in those cases in the early mid-90s. The numbers have been going down somewhat since then, but so it's somewhat of a separate issue from the juvenile residential counts.
Thanks, Marc. So on that last slide, what is page 18, I think it's slide 18, the racial equality amidst criminal justice reform. I mean, it makes total sense what you're saying about reform strategies that fail to incorporate an explicit goal of reducing racial disparity may fail to achieve such goals. And so I have actually a two-part question here. One is, in addition to the example you gave us about the juvenile justice system, where it's made things worse because there hasn't been that explicit goal of reducing racial disparity, can you give us some other examples so we can see how that plays out? And then the second part of the question is, do you have any concrete examples of reform strategies that actually have incorporated the explicit goal of reducing racial disparities?
Well, let me jump in and take that on. I guess, in terms of reform strategies, probably the most prominent one has been the change in policy on the federal crack cocaine mandatory sentencing laws. Those were policies adopted in 1986 by Congress that punished crack cocaine far more harshly than powder cocaine, and about 80% of the people prosecuted for crack offense were African American. So in the reform campaign that took many years, there was sort of a dual message that was communicated to members of Congress and advocacy groups. And first, that locking people up for mandatory 5 years in prison for possessing as little as 5 grams of crack cocaine was a very poor, ineffective strategy for dealing with substance abuse. And secondly, that it was producing enormous racial disparities that were unfair and unjust. And so by 2010, when the Fair Sentencing Act was approved by Congress in a very strong bipartisan way, really both of those issues came through very clearly and were endorsed by both liberals and conservatives. Now, it is possible when we look at the experience of decarceration around the country, even if there's not an explicit focus on reducing racial disparity, it's conceivable that we could see some reductions, partly dependent on the strategy. So, for example, New York State, which has achieved a very significant decline in its prison population, approaching 30% now. The vast majority of that decline came from reductions in the number of people convicted of a drug offense. And in New York State, nearly 90% of the people incarcerated for drug offense had been African American or Latino. So while that wasn't necessarily part of the strategy adopted by state policymakers, it was almost inevitable that it would reduce racial disparity. But we can't just assume that any given policy shift will reduce racial disparity, and it's probably at least equally likely that other decarceration strategies may reduce the number of people of all racial ethnic groups, may reduce the numbers overall, but may benefit white people in prison more so than other groups, thereby increasing the racial disparities.
And then just to add to that, if you remember, I showed a chart that highlighted New Jersey as the leader in decarceration. My colleague Ashley Nellis has done analysis of racial disparities at the state level. So in a report titled The Color of Justice, what she found was that the state with the highest black-white racial disparity is New Jersey. And, I'm not necessarily saying that these two things that are tied together, but it does raise questions. We haven't looked at it closely, but, the state has a very low rate of white incarceration and an extremely high rate of African American incarceration. And so it just highlights the point that states that are exemplary in this era now of beginning, of leading in decarceration are not necessarily leading the way in terms of having a low rate of disparity among the people in their prisons.
Oh, I was feeling good about New Jersey there for a second, looking at your chart.
There's so much to celebrate there, but we need to see more change too.
There's a number of things to celebrate in our sister across the river, state across the river. So, okay, a couple more questions, and if any of you have questions that you haven't already posed, then you can feel free to put them in the chat over to your right. Laura asked, as we know, racism plays a role in every part of the system. My question is about racism and institutional racism that exists within public defender and DA offices. What kinds of trainings or actions can these organizations take when they practice colorblind policies?
Okay, that's a very good question. There's a great deal of research that shows the disparities in the policies and in the discretion of prosecutors, so we know that's definitely a problem, and the work that prosecutors do is a black box, and there's a limitation in terms of the data that's available to figure out what kind of plea offers they're making to particular people and how they're making the decision to offer them better or worse deals. But so, for example, Vera's done some studies with prosecutors' offices, and what they found in New York City was interesting. In Manhattan's office, they found that the problem was not just, what I think of as sort of linked to institutional racism. Part of the problem there was that in the policy of the DA's office, that people who had arrest records would get worse plea deal offers than people who had less serious or no arrest records. And so given that New York City has been in this era of stop and frisk and broken windows, people of color are much more likely to have arrest records. And so just by tweaking that policy to focus on at least criminal history records, convictions, not arrests, would make significant improvement in reducing the disparity. And we know, though, that criminal history is itself problematic. It is partly a measure of criminal offending, but it's also a measure of the level of scrutiny that the community that the person lived in experiences. But at least moving from arrest to convictions is some improvement. And then on the defense attorney side, I just wanted to point out that there's actually not, I haven't seen research that shows the disparities in the work of, of defense attorneys, but legal scholars have sort of guessed about how this might work. I think it hasn't been measured very much, but one of the guesses is that it happens through triage. So what are the cases that a defense attorney really invests their time into because they're so convinced that this person is innocent and they really want to fight for them. And so that kind of decision is very much impacted by the race of the defendant. And so one other area of reform in the courtroom has been illustrated by Judge Bennett, who's a federal judge, and what he does is show jurors a video of, sort of this video that makes them, heightens their awareness of implicit bias. So it shows someone trying to unlock a bicycle in a park, and I think they've forgotten their key or something, so they're really struggling to loosen the bike. And when it's a white person doing that, the other people in the park come and help because the person's trying to free their bike. But when it's an African American person, there's much more suspicion about why that person's, potentially trying to steal a bike, right? And so the idea is through showing this kind of video to jurors, heighten awareness of racial bias, because the idea is the more people are aware about its possibility, the more they can control for it. But I think that there's a lot of resistance to both changing policies and to getting this kind of training from prosecutors' offices, and that's really, I think, where a lot of the work needs to happen.
Before we leave that, do you have more that you could share about what Milwaukee is doing with their prosecutors' offices?
Sure. This was actually part of the work that they did with Vera that I mentioned, and the work that Vera did with New York City. So they went in and crunched their numbers, and they found that drug paraphernalia charges were an area where prosecutors were more likely to, when they were charging somebody with possession of drugs or possession with intent to sale, they were more likely to tack on a paraphernalia charge on top of it if the defendant was black versus if they were white. And so they implemented a system where they would very closely monitor how often and what kind of disparities existed and when people would, when prosecutors would bring this charge. And I think they significantly lowered how often they even brought these charges in the first place. That's the extent of what I can tell you about Milwaukee.
Marc, do you have anything to add there? Or? Well, no, that's absolutely what was happening there. And what part of this gets down to is, very simple stuff that, we need to collect data on decision making in the system, and, leaders in each agency, each stage of the system need to be analyzing data on an ongoing basis. And, it's conceivable that at a certain stage we'd see disparities by race or social class or neighborhood or something like that. And, digging deep, we might find that there are, legally relevant variables that might explain the disparity, or we might find that they're not legally relevant variables. But, those are the questions we need to be asking. One challenge here is that many parts of the criminal justice system in many jurisdictions are well behind the rest of the world in collecting and analyzing data. Prosecutors' offices are probably the most challenging, where there's really very little publicly available data on charging decisions, plea negotiations, how all of those things play out. It's not necessarily willful. In many cases, it's just they haven't caught up with the technology or haven't tried to catch up with the technology to be able to do this. But I think, as the data we present here and many others have demonstrated, it really is critical for all agencies in the justice system to be able to do this. Fortunately in law enforcement, it's disturbing that we've seen so many indications of racial profiling in a variety of ways in a variety of jurisdictions, but thoughtful leaders in law enforcement have been taking advantage of having the data to try to turn these practices around, whether it's through training, personnel decisions, and the like. And we need to see more of that taking place nationally.
Indeed. Thank you, Marc. So we have two more questions, and then I have another one. One of them was, what are examples of crime prevention programs?
Okay, examples of crime prevention programs. Let's see. Well, I think that I'm trying to think there are a couple of meta-reviews out there that look at crime prevention programs that in particular, they tend to focus on policing programs and policing techniques that can help to reduce crime rates. But what I've tried to do in some of the work that I've done is to emphasize programs that are beyond what policing, beyond the police as a provider of these services. And so there's some great research on programs that try to desegregate communities and to give people an opportunity. There's a program called Moving to Opportunity, and some recent research has found that when people in very segregated communities are provided with some funding and enabled to move into more economically diverse neighborhoods, they tend to have better outcomes by many measures and somewhat lower crime rates among the youth in those families. So that's one example. I mentioned the recent studies that find that Medicaid expansion is helping to reduce crime rates by giving people access to mental health services, by giving people access to drug treatment services. So those are two areas. And then I think there are a lot of programs that also target education and employment opportunities, and some of those have been very successful as well.
Marc, do you want to weigh in, or should we move on?
No, we can move along, yeah.
Okay. Betty asks, presently, are there programs to prepare youth for community living again and so they do not reoffend?
We've got some other people on our staff here at Assembly Project who could answer that very well, but it's not Nazgol or my main area of work necessarily. So we would be happy to follow up with anybody individually, following on this too, and point them in some of those directions. Generally, I think the leaders in juvenile justice who've achieved, the very substantial reductions in incarceration that Nazgol has demonstrated, have taken an approach that basically says, residential placement should very much be the last option taken in the juvenile justice system, and only for reasons of public safety that cannot be addressed by community-based programming. And so we've seen some very, dramatic shifts there, and, there's also been, I think, a reassessment to try to make juvenile placements, very much focus on rehabilitation and not punishment. We should certainly do that for adult systems as well, but, there's even stronger arguments to be made in the juvenile justice system right now.
I would just add to that it's tempting when you look at the reduced number of young people that are in the juvenile justice system to think that it's because of the reduction in juvenile offending. And there has been a dramatic decline in juvenile offending rates, and as there has been with adult crime rates. So right now, for example, homicide is half the level that it was when it hit its peak in the in the mid-90s, and yet, and other crimes have similarly plummeted since that period, but the adult incarceration rate has not significantly changed in the same way that we've seen the juvenile justice incarceration, contact rate significantly decline. And so this really shows and underscores that, as my colleague Josh Ravner, who focuses on the JJ system, describes, a lot of the changes that we see in young people in the system have to do with the decisions that adults are making, not the behavior of the children. The children's behavior has changed, but the decisions that adults are making about how often to arrest children for truancy, for example, how often to bring them into the system even if they're arrested for more serious crimes, those are the things that have really helped to reduce the number of youth in confinement.
That's really helpful. And Betty, if you're interested in resources for at-risk and criminal justice system involved girls and young women, I think the National Crittenden Foundation is a great resource. And Dot, maybe you could put the website in there, and that can bring you to a lot of resources of some very creative and innovative work that's happening around the country. Okay, let's go on to another question from Aaron, even though Aaron starts by saying this isn't so much of a question as it is more of a wondering what your thoughts are on policies regarding the opiate epidemic and the laws being created. How politicians are taking a recovery approach versus a criminal punitive approach. Do you believe this is because this is a problem that is directly impacting, quote, white America and not just the inner city like crack did or was portrayed as in the 1980s?
Well, I'm so glad that Aaron asked this question because I'm working on a report about opioids, actually, and I've been giving this question a lot of thought recently. And I think that I agree with her general wondering. I think that it's hard to not reach that conclusion that the public health approach that we have now, that's a large component of the reaction to the opioid crisis, is very much driven by the fact that white Americans are disproportionately impacted by opioids. And so you can see that the rate of opioid overdoses is much higher among whites than among African Americans and Latinos. And that's partly because of actually the bias and disparities that prevented African Americans and Latinos from accessing opioid pain medication and made doctors more willing to take seriously the pain concerns of white patients. So I think that partly it has to do with a perception issue and more willingness to be compassionate towards whites when they're impacted by a drug crisis. But it also has to do with the fact that when white communities, and in particular slightly more affluent and middle class white communities are impacted, they're more able to have the kind of political connections and make those political connections that translate into more effective policies to address the problems that they face. At the same time, I wouldn't want to overstate how much of a public health approach there is to the opioid crisis. In particular, in states like Florida, for example, they're passing legislation to increase sentences for possession and sales. A number of states and a number of prosecutors are charging people with homicide when the heroin, in particular, that they're selling results in someone's overdose. And fentanyl is a growing problem, and especially at the federal level, there's an interest among members of Congress and from the Department of Justice to really come down hard on fentanyl, which is the kind of drug that people are turning to, partly sometimes because when they can't access prescription opioids and they're not able to access treatment because of limitations with health insurance and so on, they're more likely to turn to heroin, which sometimes has an unpredictable amount of fentanyl that leads to an overdose. So I think that Aaron's hunch is exactly right. And the challenge for advocates and researchers, I think, is to encourage people in these instances to realize that this better outcome that we're seeing for white Americans, this is what we should be achieving for for everybody. So we shouldn't necessarily try to, relaunch or, ramp up even further the drug war to get even, but we should try to take the right step and fix some of the error and correct some of the errors in our past drug policies and ongoing drug policies.
Let me just add that, there's been a good deal of discussion about the opioid crisis now in comparison to crack cocaine, which is, very much on track, I think. But we've had, drug epidemics and crises for 100 years, and we can trace, racial imagery and policymaking going back pretty far as well. If you look at marijuana policy, for example, back in the 1930s, marijuana was viewed, whether it's accurate or not, as a drug that was used in mainly African American, Mexican American communities. So it was viewed as something in the, parts of town, in nightclubs, in black communities, racy parts of town. That was the sort of public imagery that went along with it, and that was the time of reefer madness as the imagery that went along with marijuana and people who used it. 30 years later, along came the 1960s, and all of a sudden, millions of white middle-class college students and young people started consuming large amounts of marijuana, and public attitudes changed almost overnight. There were calls for decriminalization. Marijuana was celebrated in popular culture, and obviously nothing had changed about the drug itself. It was just a change in the perception of the user of the drug. That a change in public attitudes changed very quickly around that. So I think we want to keep these historic parallels in mind of how we approach some of these policy decisions, and at every level keep asking ourselves what's driving a direction towards either punishment or treatment in the policy.
Thank you. Another question from Shushila. I hope I said your name right. This is obviously a very important one to our organization and to many people who are on the call today. The question is, what resources might you suggest for those of us in the domestic violence and sexual violence arena who work to hold offenders accountable but are still concerned with the overrepresentation of African American men in the prison system?
I appreciate that question, and I would love to hear from the participants in the chat box if you all have suggestions, because I imagine there's a wealth of knowledge among you on this question as well. One resource that I actually recommend is Donna Coker's webinar. I listened to it, and I found it really helpful for thinking about this nexus. And what she talked about was, and Sue, you could probably fill in and provide a better overview. But she talked about the collateral consequences of bringing people into the criminal justice system, and the way that could have a negative impact on reoffending after the process. And so I think that one of the approaches that she recommended was to look into restorative justice approaches in order to address that. I'm not sure if I have other good suggestions to offer. This is something I've thought about a lot with the Brock Turner case in California getting a lot of attention and advocacy. And so this was, in case the name doesn't ring any bells, this was a student, I believe it was at Stanford. He was at Stanford where he was found, it was a digital rape, attempted rape of someone who was visiting the campus. And as a response to that, and the very short sentence that he got, which I believe was 6 months, and the judge seemed to be really influenced by his standing in the university community and so on, and probably by his race as well, gave him a very light sentence. And the response to that was to recall the judge And so it really raised for me questions of what it means when, when we try to develop strategies that have such broad implications like recalling a judge around a single case. So I think there's a lot of need for being attentive to what kind of advocacy and what kind of legislation we're advocating for when there's one instance where someone has maybe being treated too leniently, but that they're not necessarily representative of how people go through the system. And so tightening things up and what does that mean? What are the implications of tightening things up for everybody, and for what does that mean in terms of judicial discretion in particular in that case? So those are the kinds of questions, I guess, that I would ask in terms of thinking about how to incorporate these ideas into the work that you're doing. Sue might be able to offer more as well, and I would love to hear from the participants.
Marc, do you want to weigh in?
No, that all sounds fine, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dot, for posting the link to the webinar that Nazgol was talking about that Donna Coker did. And there's also, at that link, a copy of her article about hyperincarceration and the relationship with the anti-domestic violence field. And that's not quite the exact name, but I'm sure Dot will get that. And so, I think this is a big issue that many of us in the field are really set of issues that many of us in the field are just grappling with. So if any of you on the call right now have suggestions and ideas in terms of resources that might be helpful, please put them in the chat box, even though I do understand that the chat box may be a little confining. But these are conversations that we want to keep having. So as part of the whole goal of this webinar series and the project that we're working on now. So please stay in touch as we go along. So let me just see if I can get a few more of these questions in here. I actually want to return to New Jersey because when on your slide, Nazgol, was Solution 3, Easing Economic Burdens, you highlighted New Jersey about the efforts they have made to reform its bail system, and are emphasizing risk assessment over monetary bail. And we're seeing this happening in a number of places around the country now. But the other thing we're seeing is that a lot of those risk assessments have a lot of racist categories built into them. So this is another example, I think, of you're talking about before, unless we're really attentive to really figuring out ways of limiting or mitigating against ongoing racism in the assessment process, then how is this going to be a good thing ultimately?
Yes, that's a good question. So it's a great point as well. So with risk assessment, the way that I think about it is, and Marc and I have talked about this a lot, I think the idea is that with a risk assessment approach, you are articulating and making explicit the parameters of decision making. And so to the extent that the process is transparent and the sort of algorithm is, heuristic that's being used is transparent, then we can weigh whether or not the components are the right ones to include. So for example, risk assessment measures can, even though they're not directly asking about race, will exacerbate racial inequalities to the extent that they're targeting factors like income. Is the person employed? What is their marital status? What is their criminal history, which seems like such an obvious thing to include in risk assessment measures. But as we've talked about, criminal histories, they're not just about criminal offending, but they're also about which communities you live in, how likely you are to have been detected and gone through the system. And so but part of the problem is that a lot of these risk assessment instruments in particular are proprietary, and so they don't make these things as transparent as they should be, so they make it harder to tweak and revise the algorithms that are used. So this is an issue with risk assessment instruments in particular. But I think that we don't necessarily escape the problem by not being explicit about how we're making decisions about assessing risk, because I think a lot of times judges, prosecutors, that's what they're doing. but they're not necessarily spelling out what are the components of making them, that are leading them to decide someone is higher or lower at risk. And when we don't make that explicit, what happens is, research that shows that people with, even among African Americans, people with darker skin versus lighter skin are disadvantaged. The judge decides that people who wear their pants too low are more threatening to the community than people who don't. So with the risk assessment process that's explicit, we can decide where you wear your pants is not a valid criteria for whether or not you should go to jail, for example. So those are some thoughts that I have about that.
Let me just add a little bit on that. And the good news is I think there's sort of a growing interest and critique of risk assessment instruments that don't take this question into account. How do we set up an objective measure that doesn't inherently have racial bias built into it? Not that there's a simple answer to that, but we certainly need to be asking that question. The other approach that people are taking is to say, risk assessment instruments should be sort of an tool that you use to make decisions, but not the only decision. So, for example, state parole boards in some jurisdictions, when they're trying to make a determination about whether a person is a good risk to be released to the community, some of them are saying, we don't want to rely on the risk assessment to make that initial determination, but rather we'll make the determination based on program participation, behavioral issues, and the like while they're incarcerated. We'll use the risk assessment then to determine levels of services and supervision. So if you have a high, medium, low-risk person, for the low-risk people who are paroled, they need just relatively modest supervision. We don't want to do overkill in how we do that. For high or medium risk people, yes, they may be paroled appropriately. It just means that they may need more intensive levels of services and or supervision. So, we can use some of this technology in ways that don't reinforce mass incarceration, but actually make it help us make better decisions about how to use resources in a community setting.
Chris O'Sullivan weighed in and said that the domestic violence risk assessment instruments are transparent in their algorithms. Criminal history is predictive. Chris, do you have a link that you can share in terms of, you use instruments in the plural, so I don't know exactly which one or ones you're talking about. So if you can share those, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chris. One thing I would just add about this that makes the whole risk assessment very complicated is that criminal history being predictive, the predictive nature and validation of risk assessments also takes into consideration, also includes the likelihood of someone being arrested, and we know that differs by race, and people's proclivity to call the police in an instance of domestic violence differs by race, for example. And so then criminal history being predictive is partly impacted not just by, it's not just measuring, the predictive part is not just measuring reoffending, but it's also measuring contact with the justice system. And so it's very difficult to tease out whether we're just looking at criminal offending patterns or whether we're looking at criminal enforcement practices and policies.
Thank you. And for those of you who have called in, Chris added it's both predictive and racially biased, and she talks about the ODARA, O-D-A-R-A, the danger assessment. So thank you. And Samantha, I'm not sure. So Chris, maybe you can weigh in to see if the one that Samantha just posted up there is the one that you're talking about. So thanks. This may have already been answered, but I do want to get to at least ask it. So Danielle asked, is it possible that the decline in juvenile confinement is attributed to the number of youth being waived as adults? Is there publicly available data regarding the number of youth being waived?
Yeah, no, we can answer that question, and the good news is no, it's not primarily a function of more youth being waived in the adult system. There was a substantial rise in the number of those cases in the early and mid-90s, but that figure peaked in the late 1990s, and the number of young people held in adult prisons has come down very dramatically since then, along with the overall number of juveniles in some type of placement also. This may be due in part to changing rates of crime. It may be to advocacy around the problems inherent in waiving youth into adult court, but it's not a simple trade-off necessarily. I think it's two parallel trends that reflect just better outcomes, better thinking about how to deal with young people who've committed crime. So I think that part has been pretty encouraging. In terms of data availability, let me direct people to our website of the Sentencing Project, which is sentencingproject.org, and you can find a publication there called Trends in U.S. Corrections, and it's got data on all aspects of the justice system, including data on this issue, the number of juveniles and various kinds of placement, and those who are waived to the adult system as well.
Thank you, Marc. And for those of you who are participating in this webinar, if you have not visited the Sentencing Project's website, I highly recommend that you do so. It's just filled with just an enormous amount of really very valuable information. Thank you, Dot, for posting that fact sheet, but I also encourage you to go to their website and poke around for a while. Every time I go there, I see something else, and it's always like, oh my God. It's not filled with good news, but some of it is getting to be better news, so thank you very much. I really do appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Let's see. I mean, there's some back and forth here about the different risk assessments that, for those of you, if you've called in, we can copy out the chat and send that to you if that would be helpful. And then, there's just going back to some of these questions about those of us who are working in the anti-domestic violence and anti-sexual assault fields who are really struggling. Many of us are struggling with what's it mean to hold somebody accountable and really be concerned about over-criminalization and mass incarceration. And just some comments here, really. Laura followed up by saying, I also wonder what it means for those of us who believe in criminal justice abolition. How do you heal without relying solely on punishment while holding people accountable? I don't know if either of you want to weigh in on that.
Well, let me begin. For those who believe in prison abolition, I think it's a very ideal long-term goal, that we could live in a society where we didn't have to put people in cages should be something that everyone would want to work towards. I think regardless of our, long-term objectives, many people talk about a 50% reduction in the of incarceration or more than that. Most change in this area, as is true most areas of social policy, is incremental. And so, we do need to figure out how to build campaigns and coalitions to make changes and to demonstrate that those changes are more effective and more fair and less punitive in their orientation than the current system is. I think we've seen in a variety of ways that there are ways to hold people accountable for their actions that don't rely on excessive punishment. Certainly the restorative justice movement is probably the prime example of trying to promote healing through resolution of the criminal behavior rather than just punishment and vengeance, but even to the extent that we will have incarceration for certainly some great time to come, one of the real challenges here is just the scale of incarceration in the United States. We have mass incarceration and much more incarceration than other industrialized nations for many reasons. One of them is that we punish to excess across the board. So not only for people who commit serious crimes, but even for lesser crimes, car theft, burglary, and the like, you will generally spend more time in prison if you're convicted in Philadelphia than you would in London or Paris or Munich or many other European nations. So I think that has to be part of our strategy as well, even as we hopefully move towards a more restorative system. How do we just scale down the level of punishment overall? And that would give us a very good start on reducing this reliance on incarceration.
One other point that I would add, and I've been thinking about the Donna Coker webinar that I recommended, and I think I have a more concrete suggestion from it to relay, which is that when we think about someone who is engaged in domestic violence and sexual violence and how the criminal justice system should respond, I think we have to kind of step back and think about how that person has gone through the criminal justice system previously and the extent to which things like lower level offenses, so criminal convictions for drug possession, marijuana possession, impacts that person's likelihood to be able to be employed, and what that kind of the barriers that we impose on people who have those lower level convictions and the challenges that we create for them to get secure employment, to secure the kind of employment that criminologists talk about. That's the kind that prevents you from committing crime, the kind that gets you up in the morning early, regularly, every day, has you doing meaningful work. So, keeping people from those kinds of jobs because of their criminal convictions for minor offenses increases the risk that they're going to become, that they're going to kind of fall into a pattern of domestic violence and sexual violence. And so advocacy on those kinds of criminal offenses and changing the response to those kinds of crimes, I think has ramifications for the domestic violence and sexual violence cases as well.
Thank you. I just want to point out that Jessica also weighed in and said that in Wisconsin they're looking at the trends there to see if there are higher rates of arrest among men of color and wondering if that's an unintended consequence of the mandatory arrest law. And I think a lot of people right now around the country are looking at the impact of mandatory arrest laws that in part were instituted to try to decrease the amount of discretion that was being used by police officers. And so it's an interesting question. Did it, in fact, increase or decrease the number of men of color who were getting arrested? So people are looking at that one. And Chris, I'm not sure. Okay, or you. Okay, so Chris O'Sullivan asked another question, and isn't incarceration for domestic violence very low compared to other violent crimes? For very dangerous offenders, for example, someone used a gun, safety is separation. And I'm not sure if you guys know the answer to that.
No, I don't readily know that. No, me neither, no.
Yeah, and I don't either, Chris. I mean, anecdotally, people would say yes, but I'm not sure. I also just want to highlight that Linda pointed out the important book, The New Jim Crow, and watching 13th and how important that was in informing her, and I'm sure many of us, about what's been going on in this country and that have resulted in hyper-incarceration, so thank you. Let's see. There's people weighing in. Thank you, Sandy, there. So people are weighing in on those questions. I'm not sure there's something to bring to the speakers. So noting the time, I just want to say that this has really been helpful to me, and I trust it's been really helpful to the people that have participated. And I'm just wondering, Marc and Nazgol, whether or not you have any words of wisdom that you can leave us with as we are winding down this webinar.
Well, let me just say, it's the elephant in the room, of course, is we've had a major change in our political climate over the last year or so, and, we're all still adjusting to what that means, implications. I think, the movement for criminal justice reform, the movement to deal with domestic violence issues and the like, I think all of that is continuing and building on the momentum that we've seen in recent years all around the country. And so, we're always working in a difficult political environment on these issues. Criminal justice reform has never been easy under any administration that I can recall. And so, I think the questions and the ideas that have surfaced today are all the ones that we need to keep looking at, even as we're working for reforms at a state or local level. And, I still look around the country and see lots to be very encouraged about in terms of the direction that things are going now.
One final point that I would just add is that some of the comments that we were just describing and discussing and that I made really reinforce the need to scale back the criminal justice system for lower level offenses. But what we know from research that my colleague Ashley Nellis has done here at the Sentencing Project is that 1 in 7 people in prisons right now is serving a life sentence, either a life without parole, life with parole, or a sentence of 50 or more years, so that they're likely to spend their lives in prison. And so I think it's also important to focus on that end of the spectrum as well for thinking about sentencing what's appropriate for someone who's committed the most serious kinds of crimes, the most serious kinds of sexual violence and other kinds of violence that lands them with a life sentence often, and what it means that we're keeping people in prison for so long. What are we losing, especially in terms of being able to invest in effective preventative measures? So I think that that's something to consider as well.
Indeed. Thank you so much. I really want to thank both of our speakers today. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Nazgol. You both are fonts of information, and as I said in the introduction, we really do count on you. So keep up the great work, and thank you so much for sharing it with us today. Thank you, Carrie, for hosting us. And as you guys sign out, you will get an evaluation. It's short. If you could just take a couple minutes to fill it out and send it back, it would be really helpful to us and to the speakers. So thank you, Marc, and thank you, Nazgol, and thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Bye. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
The host has placed this conference on hold.